Okay, can everybody hear me? Great.
Yeah.
All right, so we are starting right on time today. Uh, Hopefully you have some notes that you can take this morning. I don't recommend writing down every single thing that I say, but just sort of the big vocabulary words and just sort of a flow chart is really going to help you later to just catch the big ideas of the information. So today, in order to tell the story of bioluminescence, I really have to tell you the story of oxygen. And what that really comes down to is two things: electrons and orbitals. Now, for this story, we have to go way back to the origins of life itself, to the complete and utter transformation of our planet. From stardust and rock, you guys know, came a huge explosion of life. And with it, eventually, we have bioluminescence. So let's start with oxygen. For the first half of our planet's existence, the operating conditions were pretty hellish. We've got volcanoes just spewing their guts and clouds of methane that are just so thick that the air and the planet just stayed scorching hot. Yet one thing was missing. So if you think back to any space discovery movie you've ever watched, the astronauts are always testing their air quality before they remove their helmets. And obviously, what are they looking for above else? Well, they're looking to see if there's no toxicity, and they're looking for oxygen. We know we need it. We know our cells need it. If you cut off our oxygen supply, we die. Its existence led to the richness and the diversity that makes our planet so singular. Without oxygen, our planet would look a lot like Mars. But two things are true. For the first half of Earth's history, about 2.4 billion years or so, there was no oxygen. And secondly, oxygen is toxic and incredibly dangerous. So why? Well, if you spend more than a couple seconds thinking about it, you'll see what I mean. So most obviously, oxygen can cause explosions. If you've ever lit a match or built a fire, you guys know this. If you fan the embers, you bring the fire back to life. If you pack the logs too tight, the fire doesn't start. So fuel needs oxygen to combust. The oxygen itself doesn't burn, but it's kind of like a troublemaker. If you feed the flames with oxygen, the fire ignites, it burns hotter and it burns faster. Oxygen basically brings the temperature down required for ignition. You add oxygen, whoosh. So this is why as kids, we learn how to stop, drop, and roll, and we squash the flames by reducing oxygen access. Fire extinguishers work pretty much the same way. They either spray out molecules that connect to the O2, or they just make it so the area is kind of overwhelmed by something else and the oxygen can't really permeate the area. So we know oxygen can explode, yet fire, we know it's also helpful. Without its heat, its light, its protection, and the ability to cook our food, mankind might look really different. And maybe we wouldn't look or be here the way that we are today. So as dangerous as it is, oxygen gave us fire as a gift, but it also has a role in our deaths too. So one reason that oxygen is so good at helping with ignition and causing fire and exploding is because in its O2 form, it's really unstable. So as a molecule, it has one electron that's unpaired. And so because it doesn't partake in the sharing of the covalent bond between the oxygen atoms, it's kind of swirling alone. It's reactive, it's unhinged. And so it needs a partner to stabilize. So think of a person you know who's just desperate to be in a relationship, any relationship. They'll take a bad one. They'll take the first person they see and they will just rope them in. They'll take someone away from their current relationship. They don't even care. That's what an unstable, unpaired electron is like. And so we call these home-wrecking molecules free radicals. But instead of stealing your girl, free radicals are stealing electrons. They are electron thieves, as you kind of see in this image right here. So now the victim is unstable. If the free radical oxygen molecule steals one, now my healthy atom needs to steal from the next. Who steals from the next? Who steals from the next? Who steals from the next? And if we have too many free radicals, they can weaken and damage our cells. They can weaken and damage our DNA. And it's one of the reasons why we age. So we know that UV light is enough energy to splinter molecules, and it can change them from free radicals or into free radicals that then cause this irreversible damage. Skin cancers can form from this oxygen reactivity, and so can cataracts. So oxygen's explosive. Its electron-stealing properties can cause all sorts of cellular damage, but I bet you know its tendency by another name. So if you think about food waste, this is largely, not entirely, but largely a product of oxidation. And if you immediately thought of apples browning when I threw that word up there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so O2, oxygen molecules, are free radicals. That means they have one unpaired, unstable electron. The molecules steal an electron from others to stabilize themselves, and in doing so, they set off a chain reaction. This weakens the cells, and it makes it easier for molds or other decomposers or other processes to take over. Again, think of it as that lowering the ignition point. Again, it's the same sort of idea. So that makes it easier for foods to rot, and then we have food waste. Now, if you've ever put lemon juice on a cut up apple, or you've squirt a little bit more on the top of your guac if you haven't finished it, it browns or oxidizes much more slowly. It stays fresher longer. So put a pin in this idea, we'll come back to it. So we've got another example of this. In the presence of its little buddy water, oxygen can strip away electrons from iron, turns it into iron oxide, rust. Now, what's interesting here, something I didn't know, the global economic cost of oxidizing metals is somewhere around the tune of $2.5 trillion. When we've got things like the corrosion of bridges, even the rebar instead of buildings, if they're exposed at all to oxygen, that leads to rust, which can lead to collapse. So the global economy, aside from food waste alone, aside from explosions that happen, even with the recent SpaceX launch, there's a problem because an oxygen tank exploded. So the global economy is even tied to the adverse effects of oxygen. Okay, so we got that. Unchecked oxygen's a problem, weakens our cells, weakens our bridges, damages our DNA, it hastens aging, and it can blow up. Cool. Okay, but as I said, the planet didn't have any. We didn't have any in the first place. So where did it come from? Why do we have it in such great abundance in our atmosphere now? Well, for billions of years, the O2 in our planet's atmosphere, it was an anomaly. It wasn't the standard, it wasn't the norm, it was strange. So about 2.4 billion years ago, something changed. Oxygen, a form of toxic waste, began to accumulate. It was a byproduct of what? Well, some early cyanobacteria swallowed up another bacterium. Now, the smaller one became a slave to the first, and it just kept operating as a little factory as it always had. But the larger one that now encompassed it, and they became kind of a mini organism together, that first one now gets to take advantage of what it can do. So together, the cyanobacteria now merged with this other one. They developed a process that ran on instability. They needed instability. And so they split water. There was the thievery of electrons. They passed the electrons in a chain, and that instability created more instability in the same sort of cascade we were just talking about, and eventually fueled their own growth, their own reproduction, their own expansion, their own takeover. Bacteria, cyanobacteria. The process, photosynthesis. The second original bacterium that was the slave, those were chloroplasts. So they originally were their own little bacteria. They were their own organism before they got swallowed up. And that byproduct, as we know, is oxygen for photosynthesis. So in sort of great deep historical terms, the scientists have said, well, this is where the great oxidation event begins. So it turns out a photon, which is just a teeny tiny little packet of light, is strong enough to flick an electron away from the water's oxygen molecules, and that makes it unstable. Electrons, in splitting the water, they split the water into its components. The chloroplasts were fueled by that electron transfer. We know that some of the oxygen was saved to make sugars. The rest is released into that new form. So now, because it's not attached to the carbon, it's not CO2, it's not H2O, it's just O2. So the emergence and the success of chloroplasts within the cyanobacteria eventually leads to multicellular plant life. Now, this happens really slowly. So we've got these green mats of slime, and when we talked about dinoflagellates, this is sort of the same sort of organism. These green mats of slime start pouring oxygen into the atmosphere. But because oxygen is so reactive, it wants to combine with other compounds really quickly. And so the first thing that happens is other molecules start to kind of gobble it up. They soak it up out of the air. So this is why we see so many rocks that are tinted orange. It's because those rocks had, again, iron in them. And when iron combines with the oxygen, it forms, again, iron oxide, rust that we talked about earlier. Now, just as an aside, this is something kind of cool. So that iron oxide, when you mix it with lime and a few other ingredients, and you make that into a coating, and you apply that coating to wood, it protects and keeps the inside of buildings a little bit warmer. So photosynthesis is the reason why barns are red, which is kind of a crazy thing to think about. So photosynthesis triggers oxygen, oxygen goes into the iron, we take the iron, we turn it into paint, and that's where we get that color. Anyway, so after being mopped up by all these different molecules, eventually there isn't a lot that are available. The balance shifts and the oxygen amounts just soar. And so this actually triggers an extinction event. Yeah, some of the early forms of plant life we know a little bit later could use the oxygen, but right now in this time period, it's deadly. To all the other forms of bacteria that can't do this, it kills them off. And so if you've taken biology classes before, you've heard of the phrase anaerobic. So in other words, these are all the other bacteria that can't exist where oxygen is. And we have them today, but they had to find little niche environments. They live in strange spaces, like inside of our guts, for example. So oxygen wiped just a ton of them out. Now, luckily, unicellular organisms, we know, tend to multiply and mutate pretty quickly. Okay, so quick recap. Cyanobacteria eats the chloroplasts. They become the world's first photosynthesizers. They use photons to slice up the water molecules, recombine them with carbon, reproduce like crazy, and they leave tons of this explosive, cell-destroying, electron-robbing toxic waste product everywhere. Okay, so what happens next? Well, eventually this leads to the Cambrian explosion, which you've probably heard about. It's the largest explosion of complexity in this planet's history. So how? Well, we couldn't do this. This wouldn't happen if living organisms didn't find a whole ton of different ways to deal with the oxygen, and they had to deal with it really, really carefully. So how are we equipped to deal with this in our bodies? How do we prevent oxygen from being toxic? Because if you do a quick Google search, you'll see that oxygen toxicity is a thing, and we're clearly not all dying here. We're clearly breathing and doing just fine. Well, I'm sure you've also heard of the word antioxidants. So digestion itself can create oxidation reactions. Digestion, as it's breaking things down, can also break down some of our foods, and in that process, it can create other oxidation reactions. And so we have, both from the food that we eat and from our bodies, we have antioxidants. So when we talked about food waste just a minute ago, when a fruit or a vegetable is attached to the rest of its body, to the tree or the bush or whatever, it also gets those antioxidating molecules from the whole organism. But once you pick it, once you remove that apple or that grape or whatever, you're cutting off its supply. You're removing it from all of its other body systems. And so it's still alive when you're eating it, but it has to rely on a little reserve of antioxidants in its cells. Now, once that's gone, the fruit cells weaken. Another cascade of reactions happen, other microorganisms take over, and we rot. And so on level, like, you guys know this. And I'm sure you've heard of one action we take to combat this. We ingest those antioxidants. The blueberries usually are like a key example that people cite. They haven't rotted away yet. They're high in antioxidants. We eat them and they become our own. Okay, so what do? Well, the free radical wants to steal an electron. The antioxidants, all they do is donate one. So instead of stealing it from a healthy cell, and I actually don't like this visual a lot because that clearly is supposed to be an atomic model there. But instead of the free radical stealing and tearing away an electron from something that's healthy, the antioxidant just goes, here, take one of mine. And it stops that whole process and it skids it right to its tracks. So we no longer have any home wrecking. We no longer have this cascade. The antioxidants are preventing this whole thing from happening. Okay, so we know complex life has been on this planet for billions of years. We can't have just one strategy for dealing with free radicals like O2, and there's a lot of them. So there must have been strategies earlier on, before it even got to really complex life forms like us, that led to this ability to prevent this damage from doing something so extreme that, you know, evolution would have stopped and gone a completely different direction entirely. So you may have heard of the time around the Carboniferous, which is the same time carbon from Carboniferous that comes from where we're getting our fossil fuels from. So I alluded to this a couple of weeks ago as well, when we were talking about ecological succession. And I said during the Carboniferous, this is where we got the fossil fuels from. So in this time, when the ferns and the plants and everything fell over, they didn't decompose their lignin, this protein in them. Eventually those things pile up, they turn into our fossil fuels. So that's why we call it the Carboniferous. Now, if you learned about this in like middle school, you probably learned that there's like 6-foot-long millipedes and they're dragonflies that are like 1 meter long, all of that stuff. And the normal story that you're told is, well, we see these insects, they're so big because of the levels of oxygen. We have got this explosion of plant life. We have way more oxygen in the air. And because insects don't breathe the way that we do, they've got these teeny little holes basically in their sides that oxygen can get farther in their bodies. We have more diffusion, and so they can get bigger. Easier respiration, more oxygen. That's not actually true. It's not quite right. So adult insects, they can open, I'm gesturing at you, you can't see me. They can open or close their spiracles, and the spiracles are like the little hallways, the little entrance ways into their bodies. So they can open and close them, and those lead into the tubes that are just like our trachea and our bronchioles. They've got little tubes that kind of go straight into their bodies and they branch off, but they can control just like we can decide to not take a breath or take a breath. But larvae can't do that. If you've got a little maggot, or let's say a dragonfly, dragonflies, when they're little larvae, they're completely aquatic. So they spend their lives in the water, and there's all this dissolved oxygen right there. Now, since they're just skin, they don't have these spiracles yet. They don't have these little bronchioles, which are called tracheae. They don't have that yet. So they're just those little baby, squishy little maggoty larva things. They're just getting all this just dissolved oxygen into their skin. There's no regulating it. So what ends up being selected? Well, their bodies get bigger, because a bigger body means the ratio changes. If you compare the surface area to their body to all the mass or like the meat inside of the body, the ratio changes. So a larger grub can handle more damaging O2 because there's way more stuff on the inside compared to the outside. So if we've got bigger larvae, now we have bigger bugs. So they weren't growing larger because of a need for oxygen. They were growing larger in spite of the oxygen. They're growing larger to prevent oxygen toxicity. So, okay, we have a ton of strategies too. And not obviously just taking in antioxidant foods. Some of us have terrible habits that rely mostly on hot Cheetos and iced tea. So we know that it can't just be that. All the blueberries in the world aren't going to cure cancer or fix anything. They might help a little, but it's not enough. We have to have lots of other tools at our disposal. So, who's this little cutie? Well, we know we need oxygen to breathe. So aside from eating antioxidants, there we go, to keep our O2, free radical, electron-stealing vagrants in check, we have to use other molecules in our bodies to also trap them. We have to find other ways to create basically little oxygen sinks. So we hear about carbon sinks all the time when we talk about climate change. Our body has to have teeny little carbon sinks. So hemoglobin, it's an oxygen trap. So heme, H-E-M-E, comes from the word iron. It's why our blood is red. The iron components in the hemoglobin proteins are like the Velcro for the oxygen that we inhale. Like, we know this. We've known this since we were like second graders. It's why we see the bright red color in our blood when it's oxygenated, why it's darker and more maroon when it's not. The hemoglobin proteins are holding on to that oxygen until they're ready to be passed off. So I've got a picture there of like a runner with a baton. Only I want you to imagine that like the runners are wearing like magnetic gloves. So there's no possibility that that oxygen molecule can drop. So the hemoglobin isn't just, you know, grabbing it from the alveoli and bringing it down and giving it to another cell through the circulatory system. It's making sure that oxygen doesn't just go floating around in our bodies, causing all sorts of problems. So here's a way that I like to think of it. So hemoglobin isn't, again, it's not just for oxygen transfer. It's a little bit like an armored truck that's protecting the oxygen until it gets closer to our cell's mitochondria, where we know it goes to work. It's probably a little bit more like a prisoner transport van. So those sort of things you see in like every movie, every TV show. It's got to carry the thing, but it's got to protect like the outside world from chaos. So we've evolved to use oxygen. We need it. But we have to have loads of checks and balances in place because we need limits and boundaries or just things go crazy. So we have to limit the damage oxygen can do on its own. So sometimes we've got proteins, which are macromolecules. They are everywhere. They do just about everything in our bodies. They are enzymes. They create the color of our eyes. Proteins do everything. When you study DNA and you study how it works, and how it's read in the various organelles, you're always studying the synthesis of proteins because they're one of the most important things we have in our bodies. So we know that in our circulatory systems, the protein of hemoglobins that ride on those red blood cells are protecting us from oxygen damage. We know that our digestive systems create antioxidants that give a little electron, so it stops, again, the oxygen from doing damage. Our bodies also create antioxidants to help because digestion can create them. We see size during the Carboniferous is defeating that diffusion. Now, again, free radicals have lots of ways to say, all right, oxygen, come at me. And sometimes we have a team. Sometimes it's not just one macromolecule or one little thing running around. Sometimes it's a more complex reaction. We have a pair. So one molecule is the oxygen sponge itself, and I'm going to call her Lucy. The other is a catalyst, and it makes it just easier and faster for the sponge, the oxygen sponge, to grab onto and hold the oxygen. We're going to call him Ace. So she's the protector of your body. She's a little bit like the hemoglobin. She holds on to the oxygen. She stabilizes it so it can't do any damage. It can't cause that runaway reaction. Ace is the one who starts off this whole thing. So imagine the ace grabs Lucy's hand and she takes a deep gasp and she sucks in all the oxygen super fast, and holding that oxygen so tight, it can't cause any trouble. And the ace, he's not holding any. He just kind of jump starts that reaction. He's just grabbing her hand, he's holding on, he's just jump starting the reaction. Now, this pairing, this combination of things, this evolved at least 40 different times. So we've got 40 at least different Lucys. We've got 40 at least different aces. And when they pair up, they prevent the oxygen damage that we see over and over and over and over and over again. But as usual, we have a problem. Well, problem is there's too much energy. What is happening? I just can't see my visuals here. Stop the share just for a minute. Okay. All right. I'll go back and see if it's working. Okay, so there's too much energy. So I'm just going to have to describe this for you. So inside, again, we're thinking of like Lucy as a character. Inside her body, those atoms and molecules, they're getting all this energy inside them from her holding all of this oxygen. And so her molecules are vibrating and they're pulsing. And now her electrons themselves, they're supercharged. And so what they do is they leap to an orbital that's farther away as this chemical reaction inside of her. Well, it reacts one little tiny oxygen molecule at a time. An electron is jumping, an electron is jumping, 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 jumping. And as Lucy gives the oxygen molecules their partners, so they stabilize, the electrons now are shared, they settle back down. She calms them, and she stabilizes them, and they fall back down to their sort of normal resting spot. And Lucy, as they fall back down to their resting spot, she glows. And this is where, ladies and gentlemen, we have bioluminescence. Now, at the beginning of the story, I said it comes down to three things: oxygen, electrons, and orbitals. Now, the names of these two molecules for real, and the reason why I called them Lucy and Ace, they're called luciferin, which is Lucy. Luciferin is the one that holds. And luciferase, who is the enzyme, the catalyst who allows this whole thing to happen really, really quickly. So Ace, luciferase, is the catalyzing action. Again, Lucy, luciferin, she holds the oxygen. She stops it from causing harm. The electrons, as that's happening, they jump up. They get all that energy from the chemical reaction. They stabilize, they sink back down. And because energy and matter, we can't create it, we can't destroy it. We have the law of conservation of mass and energy. As an electron sinks back down, it releases a photon. So again, there's not one luciferin, there's not one luciferase. There's like 40 or 50 different varieties. And so when we look at Wednesday and we look at Friday, when we look at these, I want you to remember that there's not just one Lucy and one Ace. There's a whole bunch of different ones that do the same sort of process. Now, why Lucifer? Why luciferin? Why luciferase? Well, Lucifer, another sort of term for that character, is the light bringer, or the morning star. And so that's where these names come from, because we have the creation of light. And so, and this is the thing that blew my mind when I learned this. So bioluminescence, we know it's an ancient trait. It wasn't selected as an adaptation that helps the organism eat or defend or mate or communicate or camouflage or see. No, the selection was protection, sorry. It was against oxygen. So that main molecule that was involved in emitting the light is an oxygen sink. Chloroplasts do the same thing. Hemoglobin does the same thing. And when we start to look at those actual molecules on Wednesday, you'll see that when you look at the composition, they have a ton of things in common, which makes sense because some degree they're doing the same purpose of protecting our bodies from that free radical cascade that we have. So much like oxygen itself, bioluminescence is a byproduct. It's a byproduct. Like, that blew my mind. You would think that this is like the thing that makes it fit, especially when we look at the operating conditions of where this evolved in. Deep, dark caves, the darkest bits of the ocean. You would think that that would be the major thing, but it's not. It was oxygen. Now, we know that nature's an opportunist. This light, this byproduct, it was helpful, right? So for the last 100 million years, it kept getting selected. It kept getting modified with descent, and it kept becoming more multifunctional. It isn't a byproduct anymore. Now it's sort of a main adaptation that helps all of these organisms, especially the ones in the deep, be so successful. Now, these various forms of light emission, again, there's not one, and there's more than one chemical process. They've evolved in fish, just fish alone, this sort of Lucy-Ace reaction, just those 2 molecule types. That has evolved in fish somewhere between 7 and 29 different times, depending on how you, like, who you ask. 7 and 29 different times. This makes it a perfect example of convergent evolution. And so we also know that bioluminescence couldn't have been selected as a trait for its light. Because if it was, we would have one common ancestor, and we don't. We have as many as 50 common ancestors that all came up with this strategy differently. And that again tells us that it was a protective measure. It was life's different way of figuring out how to stop this cascade. So if I go back to the beginning, photosynthesis has a toxic byproduct, oxygen. Millions of years later, after most of it gets sopped up and now we have excess, we have selected traits that calm that toxic O2 and stabilize it. Without photosynthesis, we don't have oxygen. We wouldn't now have the abundant, insane, beautiful biodiversity that we see today. So we wouldn't have the hundreds of mechanisms to stop oxygen's just disastrous effects. And we wouldn't have organisms who make their own light. So ultimately, it comes down to, again, this idea of the law of conservation of energy and mass. Light is entering the system as a photon. And somewhere up that food chain, as that light is going into the producer, and the producer is eaten by the consumer, and we've got all these O2s, light leaves the system. And in us, in most organisms, it's changing into heat. The radiant energy is heat. But in bioluminescent organisms, instead of leaving as heat, it's leaving as light. So our sticky story of oxygen and illumination, from there it comes to an end. So if you remember one thing for Wednesday, when we really start looking at the chemistry and luciferin and luciferases and photoreceptors and oxygen and calcium ions and magnesium ions and all these things that go into this, you have to remember the whole story. Because with the context of this comes the understanding. And then all the chemistry is going to make sense. So energy in, electron goes the orbital up, falls back down. We have light, we have a photon. So what I'm going to do now, because I just threw you guys a ton of information and I just talked at you for like 35 minutes. I'm going to split you into groups of 2s and 3s. And what I want you to do, using just some tiny little notes that you've taken, is to practice telling that story to each other so you have time to add to your notes. So if you missed something, if something didn't make sense to you, if you're like, wait, what was the antioxidant again, whatever that was, you have a chance to practice it and you have a chance to repeat it. We know from neuroscience that the more you repeat things, the more you understand it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second. All right, and I'm going to split you guys into groups. So hopefully your brain went, what? Because that's exactly what my brain did when I learned this. It made me really happy. I think a lot of times when we think about evolution, because we're always looking at it in a historical context, we're less often looking at it happening now, that we tend to still, even though we know it's not directed intentionally, we still kind of think it is. Oh, it got more complex, and oh, all of a sudden this amazing thing came up. So having a reminder that it's accidental, and so something formed that wasn't intentional and that becomes something really amazing, I think that's a really good reminder. All right, so I'm going to